They didn't see it coming, not Trump, not Wall Street, not even the Pentagon. Overnight, America's southern border froze. Trucks jammed in endless lines. Warehouses went silent. Tomatoes rotted under the desert sun. And the unimaginable happened. Mexico halted a massive portion of its exports to the United States. This wasn't a weather event or a bureaucratic hiccup. It was a political detonation, a sovereign act from a nation long treated as a silent partner. The United States, accustomed to dictating terms, was now caught off guard by a single thunderous message. We are not your silent supplier. We are your sovereign equal. The world watched in disbelief as President Claudia Sheinbaum stood before cameras and uttered just one line that would reset hemispheric economics. If you block us, we'll close the door too. What unfolded next wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Mexico wasn't flailing. It was moving. Ports, once tied to American markets, shifted toward Asia. Government envoys flew to China, India, Brazil. In less than 10 days, an entire logistics architecture pivoted. This wasn't just about tomatoes and tariffs. It was the start of something far more profound, an economic rebellion, subtle, strategic, and shockingly effective. So, here's the real question. Did Mexico just start the collapse of U.S. trade dominance? Or did it simply expose how fragile that dominance always was? President Sheinbaum's move wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate. The Trump administration believed a 17% tariff on Mexican tomatoes, combined with levies on aluminum and steel, would corner Mexico into renegotiation. Instead, it triggered a masterstroke. Sheinbaum's team, anticipating the tariff war, had spent months preparing. Emergency logistics plans were drawn, trade routes quietly mapped, memos of understanding drafted with ports in Asia and Latin America. The moment Trump escalated, Mexico didn't protest, it activated. Within hours of the announcement, supply routes began to shift. Tomatoes once bound for California were rerouted to Shanghai. Steel, scheduled for Detroit, was redirected to São Paulo. Diplomatic delegations flew to Beijing, Mumbai, and Dubai. Not to ask for help, but to finalize deals already in motion. This wasn't a tantrum, this was an escape. Mexico's administration called it sovereignty first, a doctrine that rejects dependency, even if it means short-term sacrifice. And sacrifice they did. Subsidies were issued to absorb exporter losses, domestic producers were temporarily shielded. But the payoff was clear. Mexico was leaving the shadow of Washington. The U.S., meanwhile, scrambled. Retailers rang alarm bells. Walmart and Costco issued warnings. Farmers in the Midwest watched their supply chains fray. And for the first time, the phrase, "We need them more than they need us," echoed through American media. Mexico had exposed the unspoken truth: America's convenience was built on foreign compliance. And compliance was crumbling. The most ironic twist: the very tariffs designed to protect American supply chains ended up detonating them. Factories in Michigan halted operations. Car parts went missing. Restaurants tripled the price of basic ingredients. School cafeterias ran out of fruit. What began as a geopolitical maneuver turned into a grassroots crisis felt by small businesses, not diplomats. And it got worse. While American news outlets wrestled with the narrative, Mexico doubled down. Not only did they reject Washington's pressure, they rebranded their pivot as progress. "This is not retaliation," Sheinbaum said. "This is evolution." The phrase caught fire, printed on signs posted across Latin American social media, repeated in activist forums in Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia. Mexico, once cast as the quiet junior partner, was now being called the tip of the spear, the first to defy, the first to pivot. And quietly in the background, something even more serious unfolded: talks between Mexico, Russia, and India to form a new trilateral economic forum. The BRICS Development Bank extended formal invitations. Chinese ships began arriving in Veracruz. This wasn't about one nation breaking ranks. It was the emergence of a post-American architecture built without permission. And what did Washington do? It hesitated. Trump, as expected, threatened retaliation. But the markets didn't flinch. Because the damage wasn't theoretical anymore, it was structural. America had lost more than trade. It had lost control of the narrative. If Mexico can do this, what's stopping others? Chile has already voiced support. Argentina's leaders praise the move. Bolivia and Colombia have floated the idea of a new Latin American economic bloc. What once seemed unthinkable, a coordinated push away from U.S.-centered trade, is now a serious topic of diplomatic discussion. And Mexico. It isn't celebrating, it's organizing. Government platforms are matching exporters to new buyers. Trade expos are being held in Asia. Domestic narratives are shifting not toward rebellion, but toward rebirth. President Sheinbaum's approval rating has skyrocketed. Not because she beat America, but because she proved Mexico doesn't have to fear it. The United States now stands at a crossroads. It can renegotiate with respect or escalate and risk pushing more nations out of its orbit. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Dominance isn't a default setting. It's a choice others have to keep accepting. And the world may be done accepting it. The day Mexico halted its exports to the United States, something deeper cracked beneath the surface of global trade. It wasn't just a political crisis or a logistical disruption. It was the symbolic end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. For decades, the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship followed a familiar script. Mexico exports cheap labor, raw materials, and produce. The U.S. imposes rules, tariffs, and control. This dynamic, while often masked in diplomatic niceties, was grounded in hierarchy. Mexico was the supplier. The U.S. was the center. But when President Claudia Sheinbaum stood before the press and calmly declared, "If you block us, we'll close the door too," it wasn't just defiance, it was redefinition. It was the moment Mexico stopped playing by someone else's script and started writing its own. The U.S. assumed tariffs would bring Mexico to the table. Instead, they pushed Mexico to pivot to Asia, to BRICS Plus, to new alliances far from Washington's reach. Exports, rerouted ports, reorganized trade agreements, signed with China, India, Brazil. This wasn't a protest, it was an escape plan long in the making. The consequences hit America hard and fast. Shelves emptied in Texas. Midwest farmers panicked. Car factories slowed. Retail giants like Walmart issued supply alerts. And a quote from a Texas executive, "We need them more than they need us," shook the political class to its core. What became undeniable was that America's dominance was never absolute. It was conditional, dependent on the quiet cooperation of nations it had long taken for granted. Mexico didn't collapse under pressure. It recalibrated. It absorbed losses, offered subsidies, rerouted logistics, and stood firm. While Washington debated and threatened, Mexico acted. While U.S. media questioned, Mexican diplomats delivered. In the span of weeks, Mexico reoriented decades of dependency. This sent a message far beyond the southern border. Chile, Argentina, Colombia all began reconsidering their economic positions. Support for Mexico's move echoed across Latin America. The idea that Washington was the unavoidable center of trade lost credibility. For the first time, alternatives didn't feel risky, they felt necessary. And behind this transformation stood a doctrine, sovereignty first. Not anti-American, not isolationist. Simply the belief that trade partnerships should be mutual, not manipulative. That no nation, no matter how powerful, has the right to assume compliance forever. The Sheinbaum administration didn't just break a pattern, it inspired a new blueprint. A model where nations prepare coordinate and pivot away from coercion. A model that rewards flexibility over fear. In this model, power isn't who yells loudest, it's who moves first. For the United States, the lesson is humbling. Dominance is not a default. It must be renewed, re-earned, and reshaped with respect. The illusion that tariffs are tools of control now lies shattered. They no longer coerce. They catalyze resistance. In a world where BRICS Plus grows stronger and where smaller economies are increasingly connected to one another, the U.S. must choose cling to old tools or adapt to new dynamics. Mexico made its choice, and now the rest of the world is watching. Mexico moved first. The rest of the hemisphere is watching. Mexico's pivot is not just a national story, it's a signal flare to the entire global South. For decades, smaller economies were told that dependency was inevitable, that economic leverage belonged only to the big players. But with one strategic pivot, Mexico proved that autonomy is not only possible, it's powerful. What's remarkable isn't just what Mexico did, but how it did it. There was no grandstanding, no emotional outburst, just a calm sequence of decisions: halt key exports, activate diplomatic channels, reroute supply chains, and reinforce domestic producers. It was everything the U.S. didn't expect: precise, premeditated, and quietly devastating. And perhaps that's what makes this moment so defining. Because it reveals something uncomfortable, the U.S. didn't lose control because Mexico broke the rules. It lost control because Mexico finally understood them. Claudia Sheinbaum's doctrine of economic sovereignty is now being studied far beyond Latin America. In Southeast Asia, African trade unions, Middle Eastern chambers of commerce, the question is echoing: can we do what Mexico just did? Not in the same way, not with the same tools, but with the same mindset: prepare, decouple, pivot. Meanwhile, inside the United States, a quieter reckoning is unfolding. For the first time in years, bipartisan voices in Congress began urging de-escalation. Not out of sympathy, but out of necessity. Not because they feared Mexico, but because they feared what happens next. Because if one partner walks away, what stops 2 or 10? The threat isn't just losing trade volume, it's losing narrative dominance. Once, the U.S. defined what fair trade looked like. Now, it's scrambling to explain why its own farmers are begging for tomatoes, why small businesses are losing contracts, why BRICS is becoming an attractive alternative for nations that once pledged allegiance to Washington's frameworks. This is what a post-American trade order looks like, not in theory but in real time. What Mexico did wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a rupture. A controlled demolition of the assumptions that held the U.S.-led system together. It shattered the idea that compliance is permanent, that markets are naturally tilted toward Washington, that no one dares challenge the system. But the real brilliance wasn't economic, it was symbolic. Sheinbaum didn't just shift freight routes, she shifted perception. She made sovereignty a public value again. She made economic dignity something voters could believe in, not just economists. And that shift is viral. From university campuses in Brazil to parliamentary sessions in India. This is not retaliation. This is evolution. Has become more than a slogan. It's a template. It's a weapon of narrative. It reframes defiance as leadership, disobedience as self-respect. This is why Washington is so unnerved. Because tariffs they can respond to, logistics they can negotiate. But once a narrative escapes their frame, once countries start believing they can leave and thrive, the center doesn't hold. The ripple effect could be enormous. Imagine if Argentina leverages this moment to demand new terms from the IMF. If Indonesia repositions its nickel exports away from American buyers. If African nations, fueled by Sheinbaum-style diplomacy, start pricing their resources in yen or rupees. The playbook has been written. The question is who's bold enough to use it. The final and perhaps most sobering lesson is this: control in the modern world isn't about owning more, it's about depending less. Mexico showed that exit is a form of power, that quiet preparation can outperform loud negotiation, and that real sovereignty doesn't come from being feared, it comes from being ready. This moment won't be reversed easily. Even if tariffs are lifted, even if talks resume, the psychological shift has already happened. Mexico saw its own leverage and used it. The U.S. saw its fragility and couldn't deny it. And now the rest of the world sees it too. As global analysts watch the Mexican move unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The power balance of the 21st century will no longer be defined by who dominates whom, but by who adapts first. The traditional leverage of the United States military superiority, dollar centrality, institutional reach is being challenged not through direct confrontation but through circumvention, through 1,000 small exits, through alliances that no longer ask permission, through alternative networks where Washington is no longer the default participant, let alone the final arbiter. This is the true nature of the post-American shift. It doesn't happen through one great collapse. It happens through gradual erosion until the foundation gives way. Mexico may have just accelerated that erosion, not through ideology but through implementation. It built logistics corridors without announcements. It diversified without drama. It made sovereignty feel achievable, even pragmatic. And by doing so, it provided the rest of the global South with something far more powerful than policy precedent. Precedent is dangerous for the dominant, because once something is proven possible, it stops being radical. And when enough countries act on that precedent, the system no longer needs to be overthrown, it simply becomes obsolete. Nowhere is this more evident than in the quiet institutional realignment happening in parallel to Mexico's pivot. The BRICS Development Bank is gaining traction. Currencies outside the dollar are being normalized in bilateral trade. Even non-aligned countries are hedging not just economically but psychologically. Meanwhile, the U.S. is caught in a bind. It can't easily punish Mexico. Doing so risks alienating more partners. It can't simply ignore the crisis it's already embedded in domestic supply chains. And it can't go back to business as usual. The illusion of uncontested leadership has been broken. So what does it do? Right now, the U.S. appears to be doing what declining powers often do, doubling down on the old tools. More sanctions, more pressure, more assumptions. But what it needs is something radically different: humility. It needs to re-enter the global arena as a partner, not a patron. It needs to recognize that sovereignty is not a threat, it's a precondition for sustainable cooperation. It needs to understand that nations don't fear domination anymore, they fear irrelevance. And that fear is what's pushing them to act. Because in a hyper-connected, multipolar, information-saturated world, legitimacy is no longer about might, it's about alignment. With values, with dignity, with agency. Mexico didn't win a war. It told a story the world was ready to believe. And the U.S., it lost the monopoly on being the narrator. This shift requires a new mindset from both sides of the power spectrum. For rising economies, the lesson is to prepare, not protest. To build